I'd like to thank everybody to come out here today to the Sheriff's Office, and we can give the public some information about an operation that we undertook with several federal and out-of-state local jurisdictions over the last couple of years, which has culminated in the arrest and indictment of 5 individuals, 1 out of Montana and 4 here in Spokane County. I would like to thank our partners for being here with us to highlight this good work that has really culminated in making our streets here in Spokane a bit safer today than they might have been before we had these people in custody. I'd like to say I have Eric Walker from the Eric Jackson from the ATF here with me, who will also be speaking with us after I get done. So this operation, which was deemed Young Guns, appropriately termed because this involved the trafficking of firearms to underage gang members here in Spokane County, started really a couple of years ago with some young gang members here in Spokane County who were illegally possessing firearms, and again, were also known gang members to us. Those cases were put together by detectives in the Raven Task Force. They were prosecuted by the Spokane County Prosecuting Attorney's Office here, and they were adjudicated and found guilty. I will tell you, we do not do enough in the state of Washington due to our legislation and our current judiciary to hold young violent criminals accountable, particularly gang members. Each of those individuals who were arrested and prosecuted in Spokane County received exactly 1 year in custody. So detectives, knowing that we had these violent gang members who are underage possessing and using firearms, continued to investigate gang members who possess firearms in Spokane County. Over the course of their investigations, their continued investigations, we had 2 very violent crimes that occurred here in Spokane County, in the city of Spokane and in the city of Spokane Valley, where evidence was recovered there at those scenes, duly and appropriately investigated by the Spokane Police Department, who was willing to share evidence with us collected at those scenes, things like shell casings, video footage, things like that. And through the diligent work of the detectives and the Raven Task Force, they were able to start piecing together the fact that firearms that were purchased legally in Montana were being illegally trafficked to underage gang members here in Spokane. Again, the investigative techniques, which we will not go into great detail about today to preserve the techniques that we use, we were able to use social media posts, which is very popular among youth and particularly gang members. We were able to piece together that these juveniles had continued to procure firearms, post videos about their firearms procurement and usage of them. And through amazing detective work, they were able to locate a place over in Montana where these people were securing firearms, practicing using firearms, and they were able to go out and recover shell casings in those locations, and using NIBIN, using help from the ATF, trace those shell casings back to violent crimes that occurred here in the city of Spokane. With that information, our detectives, and with a lot of help from the ATF, help from the Flathead County Sheriff's Office and the Kalispel Police Department, we were able to identify an individual, specifically in Montana, who was knowingly and intentionally trafficking firearms to gang members here in Spokane. The detectives involved authored over 40 search warrants for different locations in Montana, Spokane, on social media sites, bank records, things of that nature, and were able to identify this organization and ultimately lead to the indictment for these individuals for these crimes. And the crimes are listed in the press release, what they were for. And again, it was one individual from Montana who was the person who was procuring those firearms legally and then bringing them over here to Spokane. And we have tied them to several other violent crimes that occurred here in Spokane using firearms. I will say, it has been great to have the U.S. Attorney's Office and the ATF in partnership with us. Where Washington law falls short with holding people accountable for gun crimes, The federal government does not take that approach. They believe violent crimes where guns are used are significant and serious, and this is the appropriate path for us to now take with these young individuals who might not be appropriately held accountable in the state of Washington. So with that, and before we go into showing you some of the vehicles, some of these videos, I will turn the time over to Eric to talk a little bit about their involvement.
Thank you, Sheriff. Good afternoon. My name is Eric Jackson. I'm the Assistant Special Agent in charge for ATF Seattle Field Division. I'm honored to stand here today alongside our law enforcement partners as we highlight the outcome of a long-term investigation into a criminal street gang that has been trafficking firearms and committing violent crimes across Washington and Montana. This investigation and its results are a key example of what's possible when law enforcement agencies collaborate. I'd like to thank the Spokane County Sheriff's Office for leading this investigation and doing such a tremendous job. I'd also like to thank the United States Attorney's Office here in the Eastern District of Washington. They've been such a great and excellent partner in our efforts to make sure Eastern Washington is safe and violent criminals are held accountable for their behavior. I'd also like to thank the Kalispel Police Department in Montana and also the Flathead County Sheriff's Department in Montana. This complex investigation into the Indian Pride Organization Blood Gang, also known as the IPO Bloods, led us to discover a gun trafficking conspiracy that spanned multiple states and devastated several communities along the way. For months, our local partners, special agents, analysts, industry operations investigators worked tirelessly to uncover a network that moves illegal firearms from western Montana into the Spokane, Washington area. These gun traffickers put those firearms into the hands of IPO Blood Gang members who would go on to commit heinous acts of violence, including drive-by shootings, homicides, armed robbery, and other gang-related crimes. Through the tireless efforts of our special agents and local detectives, and with the use of ATF's National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, also known as NIBIN, we were able to connect the threads of multiple violent crimes to the IPO Blood Gang. NIBIN matched ballistic evidence across different crime scenes, linking incidents that may have otherwise appeared unrelated, allowing investigators to connect a single firearm to multiple crimes across several jurisdictions. As these threads were followed, the investigation led investigators from Montana to Washington, culminating in last week's arrest of multiple gang members involved in a gun trafficking conspiracy. While this is a critical step forward, we recognize that the broader fight against gun violence continues. Let me be clear. Those who unlawfully traffic firearms and unlawfully utilize firearms to cause terror in the community will be held accountable. Our work is not driven only by a duty to enforce the law, but by a commitment to protect those communities that are most impacted by violence and to prevent further tragedy. ATF is proud to stand alongside the Spokane County Sheriff's Office, the Kalispel Police Department, the Flathead County Sheriff's Department, and the United States Attorney's Office here in the Eastern District of Washington in this endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you. And I will remind everybody, while we had partner agencies, both federal and local, that were involved in the actual takedown of this organization, there was also a lot of good police work by the members of the Spokane Police Department while they were doing their investigations to make sure those scenes of those violent crimes were investigated appropriately, documented excellently, and a lot of their work allowed us to come in and do the work that we were doing, identifying this organization and ultimately get to the point where we are today. So I don't want to leave those officers and detectives with the Spokane Police Department out of it, because had they not been very professional and excellent at their jobs, we might not have had the evidence we needed to get where we are today. I would also like to thank, even though I will not name the detectives and the agents individually who were involved in this case, I want to thank them for not resting on just making an arrest on a local charge. They really picked up the ball and ran with it and said there has to be more we can do to keep our community safe. They are very dedicated to enforcing the law here and preventing gangs from being able to victimize our citizens here in Spokane County at large the way they have been doing. While our crime rates are better than they've been, I will say we don't have room in our community in any way, shape, or form for juveniles and juvenile gangs to be taking their violence to the streets and damaging other people, violating their liberties. That's why cases like this are so important, and I'm extremely proud of the agents and the detectives who decided they were not going to allow this to happen in Spokane County. So with that, we have some slides and some videos to show you if you are so inclined. I'm going to mess this up. Okay. It's very important always, as this is all just post-arrest but pre-trial, everyone in here is presumed innocent until proven guilty. So here's a list of our defendants. The name at the top, Ryder Robinson, that is the one person in this operation who is a Montana resident, and he has been charged with the distribution of firearms. Everyone else below that are members of the IPO gang and people who are homegrown right here in Spokane County. So this gives you some information about the IPO Blood Criminal Street Gang. There's the name. There's a lot of familial interconnectivity between the local gang sets, and it makes investigating specific gang loyalties far more complicated than it has been in the past. And we will say that gangs in Spokane, Washington are becoming incredibly diverse and cross all racial and ethnic groups. Traditionally, 20 years ago, you would see gangs, you had to be a specific race or ethnicity to be a member of that gang. It is not that way anymore. Again, this is the defendant from Montana. These are the charges that he is now facing. And again, you can see these photos are taken from social media. So again, the ATF received information that Robinson's a Montana firearms source for IPO Bloods. He was purchasing the firearms legally in Montana, which hopefully after this is all through, he won't be able to do that ever again. And then we showed that he was in communications with other IPO Blood gang members, specifically regarding firearms trafficking. And again, as I alluded to earlier, cartridge cases recovered at 2 locations near Kalispel, Montana were associated with Robinson, and they have also been connected to at least 4 shootings in eastern Washington, including a case we'll show you here pretty quick. You can see pictures of a firearm being used and using different information and some really good work from one of our civilian analysts. We were able to identify where those pictures were taken and locate casings over in Montana that matched shootings here in Spokane. This is Quentin Hutchinson. You can see the charge that he is facing. It showed that he was in communications with juvenile IPO Blood gang members about firearms trafficking. The firearm used in the Maverik shooting in city of Spokane was sold by Robinson to Quentin Hutchinson, and we even have the financial transactions to confirm the weapons sales. So there are some videos embedded into this. You can see that on April 2025, Hutchinson fatally shot a rival gang member at the Maverik gas station in the city of Spokane during a confrontation. Ultimately, charges were dismissed due to a self-defense claim, and if you watch the video, you can see where that might have been a very, very difficult case to prosecute, if not impossible, for murder. The physical evidence from this scene connects the firearm Hutchinson used at the Maverik to Robinson's firearm trafficking. Sky, am I going to be the one who's able to play the video? Or?
We got it for you back here.
Okay, so this is the video of the shooting at the Maverik gas station in the city of Spokane. And you can see how quickly this unfolds. So you can see how quickly a situation turns violent in our community. That's dangerous for everybody. Dangerous for, and 2 young men lost their lives in that incident. And the firearms that are being used to do that are part of this case. And that is why it is so critical that we are doing everything we can to prevent firearms coming into the hands of juveniles and gang members alike. And here's a video from inside. So while everybody outside appeared to be involved in the incident, think about what that's like for the clerk working in the store and the kind of danger he was in while that was occurring. And that's why this is so important. Again, Quentin Hutchinson, he's seen shooting the same firearm near Kalispel, Montana in side-by-side pictures. Cartridge cases found at the homicide crime scene match those recovered in Montana. And again, it's not easy to go and identify those places. It was fantastic work by our analysts and detectives to be able to get that very, very compelling evidence showing this trafficking and how it's impacting our community. For Owen Graham Neeson, those are the charges he's facing. He is identified as a source of a firearm sold to an ATF undercover agent. He is also a convicted felon in communications with Ryder Robinson and a juvenile IPO blood gang members about firearms trafficking as well, to be part of the conspiracy. Ethan Rutkowski, again, part of the conspiracy and firearms trafficking. We have communications where he is in communications with juvenile IPO blood gang members about firearms trafficking, and he is also convicted in Washington State Court for unlawful possession of a firearm after providing a stolen firearm used in a shooting to another IPO blood gang member. And I will point out, this is the problem with Washington state law. He had a prior conviction, and had we handled juvenile violent crime, which I would submit to you, possessing a firearm as a juvenile and trafficking them as a juvenile is a violent crime in our community, maybe some of these other crimes wouldn't have occurred. Here's some pictures of some of the group chats recovered through search warrants about firearms trafficking. I won't go into that with you, but you can see right here, I'm gonna shoot Kylie's house up. These gang members intended to be violent. That's how they resolve their conflicts. We have a real problem with juvenile violence in our country right now, and this group and this community is not immune from it. This is Dylan Doty, again, charged with firearm trafficking conspiracy. We have communications with him, with juvenile IPO blood gang members about firearms trafficking. He has been convicted of weapons offenses, and he was tied to a 2024 shooting here in Spokane County. Now you can tell he's been part of the juvenile justice system here in the state of Washington, and he was so concerned about, being held accountable again that we have pictures of him with 3 firearms stuffed into his pants and bragging about it. I don't think he learned when he was in our juvenile justice system. And that's that. So with that, Assistant Special Agent Charge and myself will take questions if you have them. And keep in mind there are some details about the investigation we cannot and will not share, but we'll answer what you've got. Yes, ma'am?
Sorry, could you clarify a little bit, buying the firearms legally and then transferring them, what that looked like to get
Yes.
them into Eastern Washington?
The primary defendant in the case, Ryder Robinson, he had the legal ability to purchase firearms. When we were coming across these firearms and identifying them, they were not stolen, and that helped us track them back to who was actually purchasing them, which then showed us, okay, well, how are they making their way to Spokane and getting in the hands of people who can't legally possess firearms or purchase them. So the guns were not stolen. These were legally purchased in state by Mr. Robinson and then illegally trafficked to juveniles.
So he would then sell
He would then sell them, trade them, do whatever.
Thank you.
Yep.
Were these weapons just sold here in Spokane, or did they make their way to other places within Washington State?
We have just identified weapons that came here. This might have been a specific relationship he had with these particular gang members. So, but I guarantee you, if we would have found evidence of it going to other communities, we would have definitely, and that's the nice thing about federal partners, they have jurisdiction everywhere. And I'm sure every law enforcement agency is concerned about something like this happening in their jurisdiction.
And so is everyone a IPO blood member, gang member, except for Robinson?
Robinson's a member.
No,
Oh, so
Yeah.
all of them.
Not everybody involved in the investigation was a member. Now they may have familial ties or friendship ties that doesn't necessarily designate them as a member of the gang. But yes, these ones are all associated with or are confirmed gang members with them.
How long has the IPO Bloods been operating in Spokane?
That's a heck of a question. What's that? Okay. 10 years? 10 plus years? And by the way, the nature of gangs these days, they change names, they change sets, they merge, they then separate. They do not act like gangs did 25 years ago. I should say criminal street gangs. They don't operate the same way anymore.
How large is the organization?
I don't have that information right now.
And then you said Robinson is from Montana, the other four from the Spokane
From Spokane area,
Okay.
correct. And there were other ties to members of other violent crimes here in Spokane where we know that incidents would happen, violent incidents would happen here in Spokane, and then they would reach out to Robinson or other members and then seek shelter over in the Montana area. And so they had ties that way where it wasn't necessarily, yes, they were rendering criminal assistance to somebody who was fleeing, but it wasn't always just firearms trafficking. There was other criminal assistance that they would provide to people who were committing violent crimes here in Spokane.
Do we know at what age they get recruited or first involved into the IPO gang?
Well, I know that not specific to the IPOs, but gangs are constantly recruiting juveniles now because they know that the state of Washington is not going to hold juveniles accountable in a way that's going to change behavior. And they know that if you're 19 and you're going to commit one of these violent acts, with a firearm, you're going to be treated fairly harshly as an adult. But they know if they get the guns into the hands of juveniles in the state of Washington, that they're not going to do any kind of substantial time in the state of Washington because of the legislation and the court rules coming from the Supreme Court.
And is this mostly inter-gang violence, or are they targeting people outside of street gang systems?
Yes, a lot of what was going on with the investigations that kind of led to this is inter-gang violence. But as you can see, it's not like they're going to a warehouse where it's just them in it. This gang violence spills over into our streets, in a gas station parking lot, a Maverik gas station that none of us should worry about going into. And yet you heard how many rounds were fired in a matter of seconds. And our citizens, our innocent citizens, are subjected to that. They don't pick and choose where it's safe for the rest of the public to conduct their violent acts. It's very much anger and pride driven, and they don't think about anybody else.
Do we have the location of that Maverik gas station?
In the press release.
It is in the press release?
Yep, it's in the press release. It's on Montgomery. I couldn't give you the specific address.
And then my other question too is, at what point in time did your guys' office bring in ATF? And I'd love if you could just give that explainer to the public of at what point do you guys recognize and bring those other jurisdictions in?
So I would say fairly early on. And remember, our Raven task force has a constant federal partnership with several federal agencies. And in this instance, when you're dealing with firearms, obviously the ATF is going to be the agency that has the resources and the information and the data. So right very early on when we started to suspect that there would be some interstate trafficking of firearms, and then again, using the resources the ATF has as far as NIBIN and sort of finding out where these guns were initially purchased and try to determine when it went from a legal gun purchase to now all of a sudden being transferred illegally to people who can't legally possess them. The ATF is the top agency to be doing that with, and so it was very early on.
Yeah, we actually have a special agent here in our Spokane office that's embedded with the Raven Task Force.
Mhm.
So he gets that information pretty much immediately.
Going forward, what does this give your guys' office and ATF, the goals for the public, for juveniles in general? What else can be done?
Well, I will say the Raven Task Force, when it was comprised as a regional task force to combat gangs and street violence, it was our way of saying, we know that we have gang issues. We know we have gangs that are recruiting juveniles who are increasingly violent compared to juveniles 15 or 20 years ago. The Spokane County Sheriff's Office has maintained our footprint at Raven when maybe other local agencies have stepped away from it. It is critical that we know who our gang members are, that we understand the conflicts that are going on between them, and do everything we can to deny them the opportunity to commit violent crimes, that we disrupt them as much as possible, and hopefully eventually dismantle them. Those are the three words: deny, disrupt, dismantle. And that's the approach we have to take for any gang that decides they want to operate here in Spokane and make our streets less safe. And I'm grateful that we have our federal partners, the ATF, the FBI, the DEA, to help us with that. But I'm very proud of the men and women who are working with the sheriff's office right now, who this is their daily task, is to keep an eye and keep a thumb on what's going on to make sure that we disrupt as much violent crime as possible.
Obviously, there's a lot of this has to do with juveniles, and there was one individual at least who had a prior conviction of giving a firearm to a juvenile individual. Were any juveniles identified as part of this investigation that we could see charges brought against in the future?
Yes, on the state side, the federal government is not really set up well to prosecute juveniles or house them if they're convicted. So whatever we can do on the state side, we will do. And by no means do I want everybody to think that the investigation into this is just done and over. It's not. We've reached a point where we've identified this particular part of the group that was doing these particular actions, and it was appropriate to arrest them. But the investigation is not over by any stretch of the imagination, because it's a gang, but remember, to be qualified as a gang, you have to show that there's an ongoing criminal enterprise. They haven't stopped committing crimes to support their gang lifestyle, and we will always be investigating that.
Can you say when and where they were arrested, roughly? Like, was it all
Well,
last week? Or?
The out-of-state arrests occurred probably late this last week. We executed several search and arrest warrants on Thursday of last week. So I know we had a couple of people who had been contacted and then eventually turned themselves in. So.
And how many gangs do you think operate in Eastern Washington?
Well, we probably have upwards of 15 to 20, but again, they change so often. They rebrand, rename. I couldn't give you an exhaustive list, and then you have different subsets inside the different criminal gangs. And it used to be 20 years ago that a gang member would identify themselves by what they wore, specific colors, things like that. And it is not uncommon anymore to see someone who is maybe a part of a blood set wearing blue now, which would have been absolutely unheard of 20 years ago, or not identifying themselves by the way they dressed at all. So it has presented some challenges, but I'm glad we've got a dedicated task force of people trying to keep as much an eye on that as we can and disrupting them.
Since your time in the sheriff's office, would you say gang violence in Spokane County is getting worse or better?
I think we are better off than we might have been 6 or 7 years ago. But I think we all suspect that things are starting to ramp back up. And there's probably a couple different reasons with it. I think our youth in general are more violent. I don't think they have coping skills that maybe other people had 20 years ago. They are more than willing to, post videos dissing other gang members, things like that. And I think our youth right now are more willing than maybe previous youth to use firearms to settle their differences. I don't think they value human life maybe as much as juveniles 20 years ago did. And it doesn't help that our state has set up a justice system that does not take into account how violent they are. And I think that's going to make things worse until we change that.
And what kind of firearms were being trafficked in this?
These were Glock pistols, modified Glock pistols. And so, again, not difficult to purchase legally if you were an adult and didn't have any felony convictions. But obviously, they were not able to procure themselves legally here in the state of Washington, so they found a source who would.
And modified meaning basically you can shoot more rounds.
Yeah, modified to where they could shoot more rounds faster. And as you heard in that video, that was not an unmodified firearm. That was clearly something that had been modified to shoot rounds faster than a human could pull the trigger.
I just had one other question, sorry.
Yeah.
Is Dylan Dowdy related to Gunnar Dowdy, who I think was convicted of murder in Spokane a couple years ago?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
You mentioned, the Maverik gas station shooting. Are there other? Can you talk about maybe some of the other violent crimes that these guns were tied to?
Just because we're continuing to investigate, I'll probably leave it at that specifically. That, and I've forgotten some of the names as I'm standing here in front of cameras, honestly. But we had a young, well, and actually the guns weren't necessarily tied to the other kind of high profile shooting. And there will be other cases that this investigation will help resolve that we can't talk about right now. Yes.
Social media obviously seems like a central part of the investigation. Can you talk about the role social media plays in cases like this and how you use social media as a tool to locate things?
Yeah, and I'll be careful about this. I will say, as we have launched ourselves into the digital age, where everybody wants everybody to see the things they're doing, whether you call it, maybe they want to flex on their gang members, and you've heard about these, diss videos that people are putting out or diss tracks that they're putting out for their rival gang members. This is obviously evidence of people's behavior, and we're not ignorant of that fact. So we will use whatever tools we need to use to find people and hold them accountable and connect the dots. And social media is a way to do that.